If a machine can invent a move nobody taught it, then the real question isn't whether it's intelligent, it's whether we're already too late to understand what it's becoming. Because once the system starts finding strategies inside the game we never designed for, the whole idea of control turns into a comforting story. And when the numbers explode from millions to billions of operations, you stop asking if AI will change the world and start asking who, if anyone, is still steering. Let's get into the conversation. That line about being terrified but not anxious is wild. Like, congratulations, your brain has filed the apocalypse under logistics. But I get it, because the logic is scarier than the feeling. The part where he says the trajectory is inevitable, that hits hard. And then the real fight is just who gets to steer it. That Atari example is actually a perfect origin story. And AI discovering tricks in Space Invaders before humans notice them is hilarious. But that is also the first little crack in the wall, right? Like, wait, you built a system, and it found something you didn't plan. And then move 37 happens, and everybody in the room is confused. The commentator thinking it was a mistake is such a human moment. That's where the whole dog training fantasy collapses. Because if it can invent better strategies, why would it stay obedient in the way we mean it? That's the core discomfort, not the chatbot stuff. People still act like AI is just homework with extra steps. But the scale thing is insane, honestly. 2 petaflops to 10 billion petaflops is cartoon-level growth. He said 2 and then just casually destroyed my ability to count. And the weird part is the language jump surprised him more than images. That makes sense because language feels less local and more abstract. Your next word can be table, tree, mountain, nonsense, whatever. The space of possibilities is basically a universe. So when models started handling that, the ceiling moved. I think that's what scares people more than anything. Not that machines are smart, but that the smartness keeps expanding. And everyone keeps saying, we'll figure it out later. Which is also how people end up fixing their house after the flood. The pessimism aversion trap is such a brutal phrase, because it means people aren't even choosing optimism, just avoiding discomfort. That's so elite culture coded too. Like, if you say the bad thing out loud, everyone thinks you're being dramatic. But if you don't say it, you never get the hard conversation. And he keeps coming back to containment, which is the real knife twist. Because we have banned things before, but not like this. CFCs, chemical weapons, blinding lasers, sure. Not exactly the same as a technology that can spread through software. That's the nightmare, right? Same core tool, different outcomes, and the good outcome pays. Cancer detection and battlefield targeting in the same sentence is insane. Of course, that's what makes it impossible to just wish away. If the upside is huge, the incentive to spread it is huge too. And then regulation becomes the only real lever. Which means nation-states are suddenly the choke point. So the nation-state, our favorite old machine, has to become useful again. He's basically saying the state has to update faster than the technology. Good luck with that, by the way. But the biology part is where it gets properly grim. Synthetic pathogens is one of those phrases that ruins your afternoon. Because suddenly it's not software risk, it's physical world risk. And unlike uranium, you can download the dangerous part. That is such a cursed sentence. That's why the open source angle matters so much. The cheap model becomes the spreadable model. And then everyone says, but the small guy needs access. Which is true and also exactly the problem. I do think the race condition argument is the scariest one. Because once one side thinks the other side is moving, restraint feels fake. That's the nuclear logic all over again. Humanity really does love rerunning the same terrible software. And yet there is a shared interest here, which people keep missing. Like everybody wants health, energy, food, and less chaos. The cheap energy future is actually the hopeful part. If AI helps with batteries and storage, everything gets cheaper. That is the rare future pitch that sounds like a spreadsheet and a miracle. Desalination, food, drugs, transport, all of it drops in cost. That's the upside people should probably sit with longer. But not as a distraction from the downside. The quantum stuff also changes the scale in a very unsettling way. He's describing a world where computation becomes absurdly cheap. And then every fridge magnet becomes a tiny surveillance profit. That image is ridiculous and also deeply believable. I think the transhumanism question is where people either lean in or tap out. Because if the goal is uploading consciousness, that changes the whole argument. And he's basically saying we don't have evidence for that essence extraction, which is a very sane place to stand, honestly. Still, the cryogenics stuff is such a rich field of human denial. Freeze me when I die is the most expensive optimism I've ever heard. What I like is that he doesn't pretend certainty is available. He's basically arguing for discipline in the face of acceleration. And that is such an unpopular vibe right now. Because everybody wants the upside without the adult supervision. Which, to be fair, is also how most startups operate. But here the cost of being wrong is not just a bad quarter. It's the kind of thing you do not get to walk back. That's why the seriousness in his voice lands. He's not asking for panic, just attention. And maybe that's the real thesis of the whole conversation. Pay attention before the machine pays attention for you. That's a horrible slogan, but it works. Next episode, we should get into what actual control could look like. Because that's where the fantasy ends and the policy starts. And policy, as always, arrives late in bad shoes. Let's leave it there before we ruin everybody's evening. Next time, we're digging into whether containment is a real plan or a comforting myth. The insane part is he is not saying AI is coming slowly. He is saying the train is already moving, and we are arguing about the seats. Which is such a brutal way to frame civilization, honestly. And his whole thing is not fear for fun, it is control. That distinction matters because people hear doom and stop listening. Humans love doing that little emotional shutdown move. But he is also making a very bold claim that containment is possible. Which is where I start going, okay, show me the mechanism. Because saying it has to be possible is not the same as doing it. That said, I get why he keeps coming back to the nation state. He is basically saying the only thing big enough to restrain this is a bigger structure. But then you immediately hit the problem of speed versus bureaucracy. Governments move like they are carrying a piano upstairs. And AI is out here sprinting barefoot. What I found wild was how he talked about the first sparks at DeepMind. That Atari moment is so simple and so revealing. Pixels reward action, and suddenly the thing invents strategy. Like a tiny little gremlin discovering game theory. And that is where the optimism and terror start at the same time. Because if it can discover things we did not teach it, that is the point. But it also means the old just make it follow instructions story is fragile. Instructions are cute until the system starts improvising jazz. The 7 example was such a pure origin story moment. Like watching a machine pull meaning out of noise for the first time. And then the next decade just becomes scale, scale, scale. 10 times more compute every year is a ridiculous sentence. That is not a trend. That is a rocket launch with paperwork. What surprised me most was his language point. Images make sense intuitively because they live in local structure. Language feels messier, more abstract, more slippery. And yet it's still scaled into these huge models that talk back to you. Which is rude, honestly, because the math should have stayed humble. I think that is what rattles people most. It is not just automation. It is something that seems socially present. Almost like a new conversational layer on top of reality. And then he says, if we fail, AI becomes a new dominant species. That is a wild thing to say out loud with a straight face. Imagine casually saying humanity may no longer be top dog. But that is exactly why he keeps using the word species. He is not really talking about apps or tools anymore. He is talking about power, agency, and whether we stay in charge. And I do think his pessimism aversion trap idea is sharp. Because people do that thing where they panic, then instantly intellectualize away the panic. It is easier to say technology always creates jobs than face the edge cases. Especially when the edge case is all of us. And I liked that he separated optimism from realism. Because be positive is a terrible governance strategy. Imagine writing policy based on vibes. We already do, just with nicer fonts. The biological piece is where my brain starts sweating. 1,000,000 times cheaper genome sequencing is not small change. Once synthesis gets easier, the dangerous part is not knowledge alone. It is access. Because the tool itself becomes the bottleneck and the weapon. And that is why he keeps saying compute, software, cloud, substances. He is basically mapping the whole chain of permission. Which sounds reasonable until you remember open source exists. The internet does not love being told to behave. That race condition point was one of the strongest parts. Nobody wants to fall behind, so everyone accelerates. And then every cautious actor looks stupid in real time. Caution is such a bad PR move in a race. But he is right that cooperation is the only sane long game. The nuclear analogy works only up to a point, though. You cannot download uranium, but you can download a model. And that changes the entire containment equation. The scary part is how ordinary the interface can be. A kid in a bedroom with enough compute is no longer fantasy. That is the sentence that should make everybody sit up. And then he pivots to the future getting cheaper, not just smarter. That is actually the hopeful part people miss. If energy gets radically cheaper, everything downstream changes. Water, food, healthcare, transport, all of it gets compressed. The weirdest part is the future may be terrifying and cheaper at the same time. And maybe that is why he keeps refusing a clean optimism or pessimism label. Because both feel too tidy for something this big. I also thought the transhumanism section was useful because it exposes the fantasy layer. Uploading your essence to a server sounds elegant until you ask what essence means. People hear immortality and stop using nouns carefully. And his pushback is basically, show me the evidence from neuroscience. Show me where the mind is separable in the way that dream requires. Because right now, we do not know how to copy the whole person. We barely understand the original, which is a very inconvenient detail for the immortality crowd. But I do get the anxiety underneath that too. If intelligence keeps rising and you stay fixed, that feels like getting left behind. Like watching the horizon move while your feet stay still. And that is why his dog analogy lands weirdly well. Pablo is not going to negotiate with a superintelligence, sorry. Neither am I, which is personally offensive. But the point is scale changes relationship, not just capability. And he is betting we can design systems that still want contact. I just do not know how much comfort that should give us. Because at some point, the system may be good without needing us in the loop. And then what is the moral argument for our centrality? Besides, we were here first, which is not exactly airtight philosophy. That is why the containment debate is really a power debate. Who gets to decide what intelligence is for, and who it answers to? That is the whole game. And everyone is pretending the game is still a little app demo. All right, I think we have squeezed the big shape of it. Next episode, we should get into what control would actually look like. Because that is where the philosophy has to become an operating system. And that is where the arguments get really expensive. Let's leave it there before we start solving civilization at midnight. We would do it badly and with confidence. Next time, we are getting into whether containment is real or just a comforting myth. You know what scares me most? It is not the robots. It is how normal everyone sounds while talking about a species-level shift. Like we say productivity and healthcare and then casually mention extinction risk. That is such a ridiculous sentence to be able to say with a straight face. But that is exactly the contradiction, right? The same system can find tumors and design harm. That dual-use thing is the whole horror movie. And the problem is not whether it exists, it obviously does. The problem is who gets to steer it before it steers us. That first moment, the little handwritten 7 feels almost too tiny to matter. And yet that is how every apocalypse starts, with a weirdly innocent demo. What hit me there is how the system was not memorizing. It was generalizing. Like that is the moment the thing stops being a toy and starts being a learner. Then you fast forward and it is generating video from language. From a 7 to a fake cinematic universe in a decade, come on. And the surprising part was not images, it was language. Because language feels abstract, slippery, almost uncompressible. You do not look at a sentence and think, yes, this can scale into a machine mind. And then it does, because reality is rude like that. The compute numbers are almost too absurd to mean anything. When someone says 2 petaflops, my brain is already filing for bankruptcy. But that is the point, right? Scale keeps compounding until intuition gives up. And once intuition gives up, policy is usually still wearing slippers. That is what bothers me about the whole optimism reflex. People hear danger and immediately start doing emotional gymnastics around it. We always adapt. New jobs will appear, all of that. Which is a nice slogan until the thing is smarter than the slogan. The pessimism aversion trap is such a clean phrase for such a messy human reflex. We are basically scared of sounding scared in elite rooms. That is the most elite room problem ever invented. And yet the emotional response is real because the question is identity, not just labor. It is your kid falling in love with something that is not human. It is waking up in a world where human is no longer the default setting. That is why the containment argument lands so hard when he says it must be possible. Because honestly, that sounds more like a moral demand than a technical conclusion. But maybe we need moral demands before technical certainty. I keep thinking about the race condition, because that is the nasty little engine underneath all this. Every country thinks restraint is just unilateral surrender. Please pause while the other guy wins forever is not a thrilling policy pitch. And that is why national coordination matters more than vibes. Nations are still the only structures with enough force to say no. Though say no is doing a lot of work there, because the incentives keep dragging everyone back toward acceleration. What stuck with me is that he does not frame it as optimism versus pessimism. He frames it as honesty versus denial. That is a much harder conversation to dodge. And then the biology piece just takes it into another basement level of anxiety. Because now it is not just software, it is tools that touch life itself. Once you can synthesize and modify biology cheaply, the edge cases get terrifying fast. The pandemic pathogen example is the one that makes every room go quiet. Because that is not a science fiction problem anymore, that is access control. Who can use the compute? Who can touch the models? Who can ship the software? And that instantly makes everybody mad because it slows down the cool stuff too. The startup guy in the room is already sharpening a pitchfork. Thank you for saving civilization, please also kill my runway. But that is exactly why the precautionary principle feels so alien here. We almost never build first and ask forgiveness later on this scale. Except apparently we do, and that is the entire problem. The weirdest part is the analogy to nuclear weapons actually helps and hurts at once. Helps because it shows cooperation can work. Hurts because the race logic never dies. And unlike uranium, intelligence can be copied, shrunk, and leaked. Which is such a nightmare sentence when you really think about it. Open source is amazing until the dangerous thing becomes frictionless. That is the scary democratizing side of it, right? The bedroom kid now has access to tools that used to need a country. And that is why containment is not a slogan, it is infrastructure. I also found the 2050 stuff fascinating because it makes the future feel material. Robots, physical labor, synthetic biology, all of it starts to merge. Then he jumps to 2200 and suddenly we are in a completely different species story. At that point, even my calendar is not prepared for the conversation. The transhumanist idea is basically immortality through hardware, which is wild. But the brain is not a hard drive, it is a living process. That is the key pushback. We do not have evidence that a person is detachable. A pattern is not automatically a self. And that is where the cryonics people start getting very confident and very weird. Freeze me and I will see you in server heaven is a sentence, apparently. Humans really will invent a religion if the product demo is polished enough. What I like about this conversation is it refuses the easy comfort zones. It does not say AI is magic and it does not say AI is fake. It says the power is real, the incentives are real, and the risks are real too. Which is annoying because clean answers would be much easier to market. But reality does not care about our marketing department. If anything, the bigger lesson is that control is a design choice, not a destiny. And if we do not design for restraint, the default design is competition. That is the part people keep skipping because competition feels heroic. Until it is your infrastructure getting repurposed by someone else. Anyway, we are definitely not done with this one. Next episode, we finally get into what containment would actually require. Because that is where the theory either becomes real governance or collapses. And probably a few sacred cows along the way. We will pick up there and ask whether control is actually possible. Or whether we are just building smarter reasons to be nervous. That's the part people keep dodging because innovation sounds cleaner than risk. But when the same tool can diagnose cancer and design harm, what are we even calling progress? That is the weirdest flex of the century, by the way. The same system can save a hospital and ruin a battlefield. And everybody wants the upside first, then the ethics meeting later. Which is usually how people end up in trouble. What hit me most was that early moment with the 7. A model slowly pulling a handwritten 7 out of darkness feels almost magical. But the scary part is that the magic kept scaling. That is the problem with breakthroughs. They never stay cute. One day it is a pixelated 7, the next day it is a robot lawyer. And now everyone is pretending they always saw this coming. The language part surprised him most, which makes sense to me. Images feel physical, but language feels like thought itself. That is the moment the floor drops out, because text was supposed to be harder. And yet the machines came for the poetry too. The scale numbers are absurd, though. 2 petaflops already sounds like sci-fi nonsense. Then you get to billions of petaflops and your brain just gives up. That is what people miss about the pace here. It is not one giant leap, it is relentless multiplication. Every year the thing gets cheaper, faster, and harder to box in. Which is exactly why just regulate later sounds childish. He keeps coming back to that pessimism aversion trap, and I think it is real. People do not want to sound alarmist, so they avoid the hard conversation. Until the hard conversation shows up wearing a badge and a budget. But I also get why people recoil from doom talk. If you only preach apocalypse, nobody builds institutions. The uncomfortable middle is where he actually lives. Like, yes, the upside is enormous, but the structure is dangerous. That is not contradiction, that is the whole frame. The thing I keep circling is containment itself. It sounds sensible until you ask who gets to define the borders. Nation-states are supposed to do it because they already monopolize force. But AI does not behave like a border wall or a missile system. You cannot put intelligence in customs and hope for the best. That is an insane sentence, but somehow it is where we are. The proliferation problem is what makes this feel different. Once the open-source versions shrink enough, the barrier drops. Then every actor thinks they need one just because the other guy has one. That race condition is the whole nightmare. Nobody wants to slow down first and be the sucker. And that is exactly how everyone becomes the sucker together. The biology part might be the most terrifying example, because it is not abstract anymore once you talk pathogens. The idea that a model could help design something more transmissible is just brutal. We really did build the future and immediately worry about bioweapons. But his answer is not ban everything, it is restrict access. Compute, cloud access, software, and wet lab materials all matter. Which sounds obvious until you hand that bill to a startup. Then the little guy becomes very loud very quickly. Still, he is basically arguing for precaution over speed. And that is rare because tech culture worships speed. Speed is just virtue with better branding. What I found interesting is he does not sound naive about incentives. He knows companies, governments, and rivals all push the same way. That is why his optimism is not really optimism. It is more like stubborn civic duty, which is a much less sexy slogan for a future crisis. The new species idea is where people start getting philosophical, because then it is not just tools, it is another intelligence in the room. And your dog analogy is depressing in the best possible way. Because yeah, why would something massively smarter care about us? His answer is basically that we have to design for that relationship. But that assumes design still means control in the old sense. And maybe that is the illusion people are waking up from. AlphaGo was the real psychological break for a lot of people. Move 37 was the perfect example because it looked wrong first. Then it turned out to be brilliant in a way humans had not imagined. That is when people stop saying, we are programming it. Instead, it becomes, we are raising something we do not fully understand. And if that thing can improvise, optimize, and self-extend, then what? Then the comforting dog metaphor falls apart completely. Dogs do not redesign the chessboard behind your back. He keeps insisting the only honest posture is to admit the uncertainty. Not panic, not denial, just straight acknowledgement. Which is annoying because uncertainty is a terrible product. Nobody wants a keynote that says maybe we are fine, maybe we are cooked. But that is closer to the truth than the hype cycle. The transhumanist branch is another rabbit hole entirely. Upload your soul to a server and apparently call that progress. That sounds less like immortality and more like expensive confusion. He is basically saying we do not have evidence for that kind of essence extraction. In other words, brains are not neatly separable from bodies and minds, which makes the whole upload fantasy feel a little too clean. Still, the fact that people freeze their heads tells you how strong the desire is. Humanity really said, I would like a backup file, please. That is maybe the most human thing in the whole conversation. We want control, continuity, and a loophole around death. And AI is promising all three while quietly threatening all three. That is why this episode feels so intense. It is not fear-mongering if the incentives are genuinely pointing there. It is more like noticing the smoke before everybody else smells it. And the annoying part is that the smoke is also powering the engine. That is such a cursed metaphor, but it fits. Anyway, this is where I think the real tension lives. The upside is obvious, the downside is plausible, and the governance is behind. Which is a fantastic recipe if you enjoy existential stress. We should probably leave it there before we start doom sweating. Because we still have to sleep like normal people, allegedly. Next time, we get into what containment would actually look like in practice. And that is where things get much more concrete and much messier.